The snow had begun to fall in gentle, persistent flakes over St. Mary Mead, turning the thatched rooftops and hedgerows into a scene that might have been painted on a Christmas card. Inside the village hall, a cheerful fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of pine, cinnamon, and freshly brewed tea filled the air. It was the evening of the annual Christmas knitting circle session, a tradition that had endured for nearly 2 decades, an evening of wool, warmth, and whispered gossip. Miss Jane Marple, neat and composed as ever, sat by the fire with a basket of soft red yarn at her feet. Her fingers, deft and precise, moved rhythmically as she worked on a pair of mittens for the church orphanage. Around her, the women of the village were gathered in amiable conversation, Mrs. Bantry, sprightly and opinionated as always, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harper, who spoke with that endearing mixture of charity and condescension, Miss Beatrice Lacey, the spinster schoolteacher known for her sharp tongue, and presiding over them all with a smile of gentle superiority, Lady Cynthia Fortescue, the widow who had moved into Greenbank Manor last spring. Lady Cynthia had been a breath of fresh air to the village, or so many had said at first. Rich, charming, and impossibly elegant, she had revived several local traditions, donated funds to the church roof, and started this year's Christmas knitting circle with great enthusiasm. Yet there were murmurs beneath the surface. Some whispered she was not all she claimed to be. Others noted that her fortune, inherited from her late husband, seemed to vanish and reappear in curious ways. Tonight's meeting was festive, with carols playing softly on the gramophone. Sherry was poured liberally, and even Miss Marple had accepted a small glass at Lady Cynthia's insistence. Yet beneath the laughter and clinking of knitting needles, there was a faint unease, a tension Miss Marple, with her keen eye for human behavior, could sense as clearly as the faint draught near the window. At 8:30, Lady Cynthia rose from her chair, announcing she had prepared a small surprise, a raffle of handmade Christmas gifts. "Do stay seated, my dears," she said, her tone light but commanding. "I'll fetch the parcels from the side room." She disappeared behind the door near the hall's rear. Conversation resumed. Mrs. Bantry chuckled over a local scandal. Miss Lacey complained about the rising cost of wool. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Someone remarked that Lady Cynthia was taking rather long. At last, the vicar's wife stood. "I'll see if she needs help." Moments later, a sharp cry echoed from the side room. Knitting needles clattered to the floor as everyone rose. Miss Marple was the first to move, her small frame quick and certain. Inside, Lady Cynthia lay sprawled across the carpet beside a toppled basket of ribbons. Her complexion was ghastly pale, her lips tinged blue. A faint scent of bitter almonds lingered in the air. "She's fainted," cried Mrs. Harper. Miss Marple knelt beside the fallen lady, her fingers coolly checking the pulse. There was none. Her clear, calm eyes swept the scene. The half-empty sherry glass on the table, the untouched mince pie beside it, and a small silver knitting needle on the floor. "I'm afraid," she said quietly, "that Lady Cynthia Fortescue has not fainted. She's been poisoned." The murmurs of shock filled the room. Outside, the carol Silent Night drifted faintly from the gramophone, haunting and ironic in its calm beauty. The local constable arrived within the hour, a flustered young man by the name of Sergeant Dodd. He was polite, eager, and completely out of his depth. A message was sent for Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, who had worked with Miss Marple before and greeted her with weary respect. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his hands before the fire, "it seems murder does not rest even for Christmas." "Indeed not, Inspector," she replied, her knitting once again in her lap. "Evil has a most inconvenient sense of timing. The knitting circle remained as witnesses. Each woman had her story, and Miss Marple listened with the patient attentiveness of one accustomed to unraveling human threads. Mrs. Bantry, flushed from shock, swore she had seen nothing unusual. "We were all talking about the fete raffle, you see. Cynthia, Lady Cynthia, seemed perfectly fine when she left. Miss Lacy, prim and tight-lipped, declared she'd noticed Lady Cynthia growing pale earlier. She looked fatigued. Perhaps her heart simply gave out. The vicar's wife disagreed. Nonsense. The poor woman was cheerful as ever. Then there was Mr. Jeremy Fortescue, Lady Cynthia's stepson, who had arrived unexpectedly that afternoon from London. Handsome in a sullen sort of way, he had been invited to join the ladies after dinner but declined. Now he appeared in the doorway, his face grave. "My stepmother, poisoned? That's impossible. She was in perfect health." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple, watching him over her spectacles. Though good health rarely deters murderers, Craddock questioned him gently. Jeremy admitted there had been quarrels, financial ones. The estate, once considerable, had been dwindling. His late father's will left most of it to Cynthia, much to Jeremy's dismay. Yet he insisted he bore no ill will. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had already begun to note the subtler signs. Mrs. Harper's nervous glances at Miss Lacy, Miss Lacy's tight-lipped silence when asked about her private lessons at Green Bank, and Mrs. Bantry's sudden recollection that Lady Cynthia had switched knitting seats halfway through the evening, taking Miss Lacy's chair because it was closer to the fire. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. So many little changes, like threads in a tangled pattern. When the police doctor confirmed cyanide poisoning, the village reeled. How could such a thing have happened here, amid wool and teacups? But Miss Marple, calm as ever, simply nodded. Human nature, Inspector, the most fascinating substance on earth. It never varies, even when wrapped in tinsel and good manners. Snow continued to fall over St. Mary Mead as the investigation deepened. The knitting circle, once a bastion of comfort, now felt like a web of deceit. Rumors spread quickly that Lady Cynthia had been blackmailing someone, that she'd planned to sell Greenbank, that her charm hid darker manipulations. Miss Marple visited Greenbank Manor the next morning. The drawing-room still smelled faintly of lilies and expensive perfume. She examined the teacups, the decanter, the delicate lace doilies. All appeared perfectly in order, except for one curious absence. "Her knitting bag," said Miss Marple softly. "It's missing. That bag, seen by all the ladies, had been made of tartan wool with an ivory handle. It had contained several silver needles, and one peculiar little flask of tonic Lady Cynthia was said to sip from during their sessions. By afternoon, the tonic bottle was found in the waste bin, empty, smelling of almonds. Yet someone had attempted to wipe it clean. Clever, Craddock muttered, but not clever enough. Suspicions shifted. Mrs. Harper had been overheard arguing with Cynthia about the church funds. Miss Lacy was said to have lost money in one of Lady Cynthia's investment schemes. Jeremy Fortescue, meanwhile, had been seen leaving the side room earlier in the evening. Each story contradicted another. Each suspect seemed to weave a tighter knot. Miss Marple sat quietly by her hearth that night, her cat asleep beside her, reflecting. People are very much like knitting, she mused aloud. One wrong stitch and everything unravels. But if you look closely, you can always tell where the pattern went wrong. And then she remembered something. The silver knitting needle found beside Lady Cynthia. It had been clean, though Cynthia's hands had been dusted with powder from the wool. Someone placed it there, Miss Marple whispered. Afterwards, a few more threads fell into place. The next morning, she visited Miss Lacy. The schoolteacher was pale, jittery, and uncharacteristically polite. On her table sat a cup of untouched tea and a single mitten, unfinished, its red yarn slightly darker than the others. Such lovely work, Miss Marple said mildly, though this shade of red, so close to crimson, almost the color of a label, perhaps. Miss Lacy froze. The label on Lady Cynthia's tonic had been red, and Miss Lacy, meticulous and tidy, would never have tolerated a mismatch of yarn, unless she'd run out suddenly in need of something to replace it. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do believe, my dear, you've made a dreadful tangle for yourself." That evening, Miss Marple invited Inspector Craddock and the remaining members of the knitting circle to tea at her cottage. The table was set with exquisite neatness, scones, marmalade, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling. "I thought," she said pleasantly, "we might discuss what really happened to poor Lady Cynthia." The room grew still. "It was a clever little plan," Miss Marple continued. "Someone switched the tonic bottle in her knitting bag with another identical one, this one laced with cyanide, but of course that someone had to know she always took a sip during the circle." Her blue eyes twinkled. "Only one person knew that detail, because she was the one who prepared Lady Cynthia's tea every week." Mrs. Harper gasped. "You can't mean—" "Oh, not you, my dear. You were too busy gossiping to notice. No, it was Miss Lacy." All eyes turned to the schoolteacher. Her face was ashen. She had been deceived. Miss Marple said softly, "Lady Cynthia promised to invest her modest savings, money intended for her aging mother, but Cynthia, alas, had squandered it. When Miss Lacy discovered the truth, she planned a small revenge. She meant only to make Lady Cynthia ill, nothing fatal. But cyanide is an uncooperative substance." Miss Lacy's knitting needles trembled in her lap. "She ruined everything I had," she whispered. "I didn't mean—" "I believe you," Miss Marple said gently, "but intent cannot alter outcome. Murder, no matter how mild the motive, remains murder." Craddock stepped forward solemn. "You understand, Miss Lacy? You'll have to come with me." Miss Lacy nodded, weeping quietly. As she rose, Miss Marple noticed a single red thread caught on her cuff, crimson yarn from that unfinished mitten. The final unmistakable proof. A week later, the snow began to melt, revealing the green shoots of holly and ivy. The knitting circle met again, smaller now, subdued but determined to continue. Miss Marple sat by the window, knitting calmly as the village buzzed once more with gentle chatter. Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Such a dreadful business. Who would have thought dear Miss Lacy capable of murder?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One should never underestimate the quiet ones, my dear. In every village, beneath the lace curtains and flower pots, lie passions most extraordinary." Outside, the church bells chimed for Christmas Eve. The scandal had already begun to fade into legend. The knitting circle affair, they called it. Jeremy Fortescue had inherited what little remained of Greenbank, though Miss Marple suspected he'd soon squander it. Mrs. Harper had taken up embroidery for a change of pace, and Mrs. Bantry was already composing her own dramatic retelling for the Women's Institute. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple finished the second mitten she'd begun on that fatal night. She folded it neatly, added it to a parcel bound for the orphanage, and poured herself another cup of tea. In her heart she felt no triumph, only a quiet melancholy that even in such a peaceful village, human frailty could weave such dark patterns. Still, as she glanced out at the snow and the golden glow of the lamplight, she smiled softly. "Christmas," she murmured, "isn't about perfection, but redemption, and perhaps even poor Miss Lacy may find hers." She rose, drew the curtains, and sat once more by the fire, her knitting needles clicking gently in the warm, still air. Outside, the church choir began to sing, "O come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant," and in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, peace of a sort returned once more